Welcome, adventurers, to the Indie Game Lunch Hour. Today, we're talking with Quinn Elmer about the Storytelling Toolkit, making better narrative and quest designs.
The Indie Game Lunch Hour.
Take a sip of my Dunkin' while that's going. Welcome all to our live magical podcast where we give game developers the chance to hear stories of breaking in from industry experts, as well as directly ask them questions about their areas of expertise in the second half of each episode. This is a live podcast that we host here in our Discord every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. So feel free to swing by and join us for the next one and even ask your own questions of our wonderful guests. As always, I'm your host, Willem Delventhal, the headmaster here at the Indie Game Academy. And joining me today is Quinn Elmer, an absolutely prolific man who needs no introduction. He is actually the original mind behind Warcraft, as well as Mass Effect and a number of other gigantic games. That's a joke, but he is a senior narrative designer, a lead narrative designer even, who previously worked at Lost Boys Interactive on a number of projects, as well as Crazy Maple Story. I happened to run into Quinn at M Plus Dev in Madison, Wisconsin, just a couple of weeks ago, and he just happened to show me his cool talk from MDev, and I found it fascinating and already now use it in my day-to-day design life. So thank you, Quinn, and welcome to the show. What are you having for lunch here today?
Well, let's see. Thank you for having me as well. It's 11 Central Time. I'm on that Midwest time zone. So in about an hour, I had an apple to start before we kick things off.
Got a little fiber in.
And then, I've got a really cool landlord who drops off Costco stuff in our basement. We share a basement unit. So he gave us a whole rotisserie chicken.
Wow.
So I'm not going to eat the whole rotisserie chicken. But
it's very generous, though.
We'll reheat some of that. Maybe some mashed potatoes, kind of a nice winter vibe. So, yeah.
So is that like the premium package from the landlord? Like you pay an extra $39.99 a month, and you get.
Maybe it's factored in. It's kind of like how utilities are factored in to the.
Yeah. That's the premium edition.
It's like a rental plus membership.
Right.
Yep.
Right. Amazing.
Sweet.
Welcome to the show, dude. It was actually such a pleasure to meet you at MDev. Immediately felt some like kindred energy. For those who don't know Quinn has a ton of narrative as well as design experience, and specifically showed me at MDev and gave a talk at MDev on something that he calls the Storytelling Toolkit, which is more or less a way to lay out story beats, but more than that. I would love an intro from you, Quinn, on what the heck that is.
It's kind of the name I've just been calling what's really just a collection of approaches or methods to tell a story in something that's interactive, like a video game, beyond just like the traditional dialogue and cutscenes that we know very, very well at this point in the industry, right? So it's the toolkit broadly is really just each discipline, if you think about it. So sort of we have our writing tools, which are very important, but we also have design tools in the toolkit that you can use, level design to tell stories, things like that, combat design, art, environment art, even the concept art early phase can be huge for ultimately pulling off a story. And then you've got your engineering tools as well at the end, like things like systems can help tell stories as well. And so that's kind of in my head, I think of it as a suite of like, you bring this toolkit with you as a narrative designer to every project, and you're not always going to be able to use each of those tool sets, so to speak, but it's important to try to remember that they're there and look for opportunities on each project for, you know what, this game, The Last of Us is an example, right? Where it's like, we have the plot of The Last of Us, where this happens, then this happens, then this happens. But every story, that might be the plot of that story, but there's also lots of themes surrounding the story of The Last of Us beyond just like, the father-daughter relationship. There's survival and like, what would you do to survive? All that kind of stuff. You could explore a lot of those other themes as well through some of the tools. So that's awesome. The high level view, I'd say.
Yeah, we can talk a little bit more about it in a moment. By the way, this is unrelated, but I am seeing that my internet here is a little shaky, so sorry everybody who's watching it live if you're not getting perfect video. But yeah, I am seeing you periodically pause. I just get little snippets of video, and you're a very expressive person, because so far 9 out of 10 of them have been just like perfect poses. I'll send you some screenshots later.
Nice. Okay. Am I freezing for folks in the chat as well, or am I looking pretty fluid? Because we can definitely go cams off if we
Oh
need
no,
to.
this is all good. I'm not we don't need to fix anything. It's perfect. It is
Sure.
freezing, but that's fine. All right. Now this storytelling toolkit is really fascinating, and we will get more into it. I would love to give people at least a rudimentary idea of what it is and how to use it. But before then, we have to start with the important question, which is Quinn, would you please tell us your origin story, how you got started in games, and how you got to where you are today?
Yes. So I was bitten by a radioactive narrative spider. I don't know. I didn't have
Yeah,
that thought.
what creature would it be?
So
Like a
yeah,
raven or an
ooh,
owl?
that sounds really cool. Raven's
Yeah.
too cool for me, probably. But yeah. So I've always kind of since I was a kid, like my mom loves to bring up the anecdote that in preschool I was even designing games. I like made some game called Puppies that got so popular in my preschool class that my teacher, who probably was working really hard on her lesson plan, right, that just got blown out of the water because this kid, all the kids wanted to keep playing Puppies, so she had to like say like Puppies are canceled today. We're not playing the puppy game. Like so, my first game got canceled, gang,
Wow.
from a from a young
You've been
age,
dealing
I guess. Now,
you've been dealing with layoffs since the beginning.
yeah, so that's true origin story. I guess you really want to go way back, but yeah, I've always been fascinated by stories of all types, and saw a lot in like the characters that I loved growing up. But fell in love with games from a young age too, and then but really actually when it hit like the college years, I didn't know really what I wanted to do. So I was looking into education because I did love. I had one of those cool social studies teachers, right? That most people I feel like have some cool teacher they connected with. I explored social studies, and was actually pursuing education and becoming a teacher in undergrad here at UW Madison here in Wisconsin back in 2011, 2012. And then just by chance, a friend of mine who was an engineer, he was working at a small little educational game studio that actually was here in Madison. So that at the time, that was kind of a growing bubble, a little bit of just educational games. So there had been some professors way from the East Coast that came to Madison that kind of started doing that. So I got my first gig. I did a game jam actually with some people on the weekend. And I was actually starting off in audio. I was messing around with lots of audio stuff at the time, trying to become one of those like bedroom producers or whatever they call it. And yeah, I essentially got a couple paid contract gigs from that because I got to know everybody and they were like, hey, this person's cool. And so over those next few years, as I got my teaching background, I was continuing to pick up like educational game work and getting more and more into that. So that was really cool. Like these two things were happening in parallel. And I was like, you know what? Games can be used for learning. There's so many fundamental principles of education and learning that just are in games, right? A lot of game design, I would argue, is just teaching, teaching the player. So I went off, I started my teaching career very briefly and then made a big pivot. When I was out on the East Coast, there was a grad program I was made aware of at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. There was a certain sub program that's called the Technology, Innovation, and Education Program. So I'm like, oh my gosh, technology and education. Maybe I can bring these things together. Did that, and then that's kind of where the needle moved for me, where I'm like, you know what? I just truly love games and I want to work in them. And I want to start maybe really, earning my stripes, so to speak, in that AAA level of just like, let's make some things, ship some things. So that's when I pivoted over to design. I'm doing the podcast extended version of my origin story, by the way. I hope it's okay.
Oh, this is
Like I
good.
know we've got a little bit of time.
Honestly, people
So
love
yeah,
this because, it
okay,
tells
great.
so much about how, they can get through it.
Yes, I will say this is a demonstration of how everyone's path is different and it can be really weird and roundabout and um, just for the sake of connections and showing how they can kind of pay off sometimes.
Mhm.
Part of what helped me get into that grad program was actually the person who ran that educational game studio started off at MIT. So like when I was in Boston, took a meeting with someone at MIT who then knew somebody in the program, right? So it's just like things can lead to the next thing. And then out in LA, I bought a little green Prius in Wisconsin, and I drove out to LA after graduation and started. This was 2019, so I started networking, doing coffee networking for that time. For the last year, you could do that for the next few years because a major global event was about to happen where you couldn't go get coffee with people.
I don't
But
know
I
what
got
you're
to meet really
referring
cool people. Yeah, I don't know what that was, but so one of the meetings I took in particular, just to kind of try to network and learn more about what field I could be in. I couldn't code, so I knew engineering was kind of out of the question. I'm not really an artist, so art also was not it for me. And I didn't want to keep pursuing audio. Um,
Mhm.
I really just didn't. For me, it was not something I saw myself doing full time as a career path. So design was kind of the remaining realm. So I took a lot of meetings to try to meet with anybody I could to learn more about game design. And probably the most fundamental meeting I took that really helped was at the time I think he was game design manager at Sony Santa
Mhm.
Monica. His name's Mike Ellis. And it was funny because he took the time. He was nice enough to get a coffee with me for like 20 minutes on his lunch break or whatever. So I drove all the way to meet him and sat down and asked him some questions. He was the one to break down all the sub disciplines of design for me for the first
Mhm.
time, right? There are, at least in AAA, there are combat designers, there are level
Mhm.
designers. And then he said, and then there are something called narrative designers. And I was like, wait. What's that one? Like, tell me more about that one. And he's like, well, it's kind of a newer discipline. And he was describing, your role is really like focusing on the story the game's trying to tell and the characters and individual quests and missions. Everything he was saying for the first time in my life, I was like, oh my gosh, I've been a jack of all trades this whole time. And this jack has finally found maybe his trade, right? Like, this is it. Like, it took me that long to kind of find my thing that got me that excited.
Mhm.
So had my heart set on that, picked up some contract game design work from people who were nice enough to kind of give me a shot. And then, pandemic hit. And I had actually just accepted an offer. It's a mobile game. You mentioned it earlier. It's a mobile game and interactive story studio called Crazy Maple Studio.
Mhm.
And I worked on a project called Spotlight there, which was a newer app that they were trying to put out. So that was my first really like paid with a salary and everything technical kind of gig, because I should say I was finding time and again the loop of, hey, we can't hire you because you don't have enough experience,
Mhm.
but we're not going to hire you so you can get that experience, right? Like, so I was like, I need to work somewhere for a year. So I did that. And then the last piece of this story is how I found the job at Lost Boys. And here's the weirdest, you know, connection back, kind of a classic storytelling callback. Remember all those educational game people I said I worked with way back in college? Over the years, two of them had landed at Lost Boys. And I
Hmm.
had kind of kept in touch with them, had actually been working on an indie puzzle game with them at the time. And so they said, hey, man, we're hearing a rumor that Lost Boys might need someone focused on narrative soon. So I got really lucky in terms of like, sometimes you just meet the right moment where the job hasn't maybe even been created yet,
Hmm.
right? So you get to have those early discussions with someone and just kind of almost create that job together. So I got the chance to do that, and have a really great person who's still a great mentor and friend of mine, Chase Jones, who kind of gave me that shot at Lost Boys. And then it was 3.5 years of really really fun co-development. That's what they do
Mhm.
there. So you work with all sorts of studios on their projects. So it was a huge like crash course in that like AAA level of game design fundamentals, and then narrative design too. So yeah,
Amazing.
now we're looking for the next thing now. So
Nice. There you are. Wow, very cool. I think there's a bunch of stuff every time we do one of these stories. It's part of the reason that it's the core question of this podcast. There's always call outs. The first one I want to do is a call out personally, just because I think it's so funny. Some of my first design experience was building board games for my elementary classrooms.
nice.
I used to pitch to my professors that I would do a board game instead of a book report. I'd like, instead of writing, I would just make you a board game. Never once had
Yeah,
a teacher say no, and I have multiple
cool.
memories of full days spent playing my mostly crappy board games. Had a
Yeah.
really cool one about fighting dragons. That was my favorite one.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, so I loved starting that. Make games, people. That's really the first lesson.
Yeah.
Two other callouts, though. I think I want to echo for a moment you like finding your niche. You described learning what narrative design is for the first time and realizing, like, man, this just clicks. I run
Mhm.
into a lot of people who are nervous about finding their niche or feel sort of like almost threatened by finding their niche. They don't want to pigeonhole themselves, or
Mm.
they just like don't have something that quite feels right. And I want to say two things here, which is one, like sometimes it just takes time. You can still keep moving forward and just take your best guess. And then two, uh, it is your niche may change, and that's okay too. You can take your
Yep.
first guess
Right.
and become really good at something, and then be like, actually, this isn't quite my thing, or just, you know what, this other thing is more exciting now, and you can definitely transfer over. It can be a little bit more
It's like
complicated,
changing
but
your major in college. If you go to
yeah,
college, oftentimes you change your major at least once. Right. That's
yeah,
always the joke, at least. Yeah. So.
yeah, right, exactly, and add an extra year at the end to make sure you can finish that major.
Yep.
So yeah, it is totally cool to change your niche and your profession. Like that is fine. Don't stress yourselves out. Just try stuff and make games.
Yep.
And the last thing to call out is the referrals and networking. We actually already have
Yeah.
a question it looks like that we'll ask later about networking.
Sure.
I think when people freshly approach networking, they think that it's like, I'm going to go to GDC and I'm going to talk to somebody and impress them so hard that they give me a job that minute. That
Yeah.
happens, but is like, it doesn't really happen.
Right.
The vast majority of referrals I've ever had and that I've ever heard about on this podcast, which we've now interviewed, well over 100 smart people like Quinn, it is almost always a relationship that they've had for a prolonged period of time that they have kept alive,
Yeah.
and then it just so happens that the role comes from that space. So networking
Yep.
is really just about building and maintaining relationships over time, as opposed to expecting something to happen overnight. Would you
100%.
agree with my call outs from
Like
your beautiful story?
every word you said, as Luke Skywalker would say, I'm going to flip his quote. Every word of what you just said was right, in my opinion.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's like they're like plants, like any other relationship, and you want to treat them like an actual relationship, not this transactional thing, because people can smell that from a mile away too.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's really true. Networking is so much about, I mean, this actually makes it feel a little bit transactional, but I say it because I think some people really need to hear it. It's about kind of figuring out how to deliver them value on a regular basis. But the term
Yeah.
value is very open and flexible. It could just mean that they enjoy talking to you.
Yes.
But as long
Right.
as you kind of keep yourself in their mind. Yeah.
If you meet somebody even if you may not feel like it, this is actually a pro tip I heard once from someone who works in Broadway as a Broadway actor, who was just kind of like, they at the time were working with big stars, right? It can be very
Mhm.
intimidating. You're like starting off, and you have to just be in that room and kind of consider yourself the same, even if you don't feel like it at all. Talk to them as an equal colleague, right?
Yeah.
And so, similarly, if you're talking to somebody who's been like a 10-year veteran or more in AAA or whatever studio, you know, you obviously still want to open up and ask questions and things like that, and like come from a place of assuming that you're here to learn, but also have that confidence of like you've studied this craft, whatever that niche of yours is, and you have your own thoughts and opinions as well.
Yeah.
So.
And yeah, they may be wrong, they may evolve, they may be right though. And you may even teach this
Right.
10-year veteran something new. I have a personal story. I went to IGDC just recently. I'm fresh back from India,
Yeah.
and there was a speaker mixer on the very first night. And I left after an hour and a half because I got so anxious with all the smart 10-year veterans from AAA companies. Um, so sometimes maybe I don't know. I don't know if that actually helps anybody. Take a break. Later, I
Yeah.
met a bunch of
Yes.
really cool people.
Oh yeah, conferences are like so overstimulating, right? Like there's
Yeah,
at least one moment in whenever I go to one where like my whatever, haven't eaten in a while, whatever, and you just get that like,
yeah,
your nervous system is like, hey, take a breather. Like,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. That conference was great because I had a hotel in the room, so there were multiple in the building. So there were multiple times where I just was like, I'm gonna go hide now. uh, all right, so let's get to the storytelling toolkit. So I was particularly
Okay.
excited to talk about the storytelling toolkit, in particular for quest design, because I'm currently working at Mod Collective, and Mod Collective's MO is making what we call PGC, premium generated content. Basically, we make something between mods and actual like licensed DLC. So we make high quality stuff, but it's always project based and it's always quite little. So the projects are pretty short.
Sure.
Like 2 months is a long lifespan for one of our projects. So the reason that I bring
Okay.
this up is because your storytelling toolkit answered a fundamental problem I have, which is a quick way to communicate what the quest actually is in a way that we can all agree upon and all
Yeah.
contribute to in our disparate areas of expertise.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that process I showed at the most recent MDev, and hopefully I think that talk will come out at some point. I think they said they're going to publish it, so I'll be sure to let you know if that goes out.
Yeah, you sent
That
me that one video as well as a PDF. Are you willing to share those two things? I can drop that in the chat.
Sure, that's okay. Yeah.
Okay.
If you have that on hand, yeah. I think the important thing is like I've given two talks so far, but both at MDevs. The first one I gave was much more like an introductory type of talk, mostly like, honestly, it was really introducing what I think narrative design is. But with that, it was basically packaged in this storytelling toolkit, right? So the first talk went chunk by chunk through each of those disciplines that we talked about at the beginning, where you've got, okay, you have your writing tools, right? In case you didn't know, you've got things like barks and full-blown cutscenes, right? Lore, things like that. Those are great, powerful storytelling tools. Here's some pros and cons, things to be mindful of about those. Then similarly, right, showing how design and your game designers on your team can have a huge role in telling stories. The way your level is shaped, right? There's a classic example in God of War, the first one, when you first lose track of Atreus, they put you in that, oh my gosh, I lost my kid, I don't know where my kid is moment, and they put you in a really constrictive, narrow, winding path with fog, and the level literally shrinks and constricts to make you feel grounded in what Kratos is feeling, right? So they use the physical level to help tell the story, right? Then I talked about art tools, again, environmental storytelling we're more familiar with, talking with your artists about not the story of the mission, but the story of the space that mission is taking place in, right? Things happened in this space long before the player ever got there, right? So how do we kind of layer that in as well? So art can be used as a storytelling tool. And then the last one is, systems. So your engineers also need to be brought on board. You need to include all the departments as much as possible when talking about pulling off a story in a game. So your engineers oftentimes need to build those core mechanics, first of all, but also looking for moments where the systems can be played with. The AI system maybe could be tweaked and tuned for a certain moment where the engineering is doing the storytelling lifting, if you will, or the work. And the quick example, once again, actually referencing God of War, which I do in that second talk, is that Atreus later, your son in the game, starts to rebel against you. And they have that happening in the dialogue and things like that, but they also tweaked under the hood his AI tree, his AI behaviors, so that he's running off ahead of you and he's attacking enemies before you're ready and all these kind of things. So they literally use an engineering system to convey something, right? To help tell the story. So that's
tell the story. Yeah.
Yep. So that's basically my big thing is sort of we've been making, as an industry, games for a long time now. And we need to try, in my opinion, more and more to maximize the cool stuff that only games can do, right? The cool things with storytelling that only games are able to do. Movies and TV can't do it because we are sitting on the couch and we're watching a character on screen, right? I'm not Frodo Baggins, I might yell at the screen in a horror movie don't go left, right? But in the game, I get to do that, right? But there's so many ways games can listen, and listen in terms of what buttons have you pressed, where are you going? So that's maybe the pretext. So this second talk you mentioned is actually more of a practice or an approach, and it involves all those tools. But really what it is thinking also about, so I should say, in this second talk, I added a new tool to the toolkit, which is actually just a hammer, basically. And that's because, and the whole joke is it's kind of heady, but you as a narrative designer, you are the hammer sometimes. You need to basically, a lot of times what happens in my experience is two departments, could be any two departments, sort of this invisible wall will start to form between two departments where, one half is that's not my job, I do this. And the other person's they handle that, right? So what I talked about in the talk was a lot of times it's the writers, if you have traditional actual screenplay writers on your narrative team, and then a wall between them and the designers, the level designers, who oftentimes they are the ones who they take your baby, so to speak, right? If your script is your baby, they're the ones that actually have to go hook up each individual line and get it to play, and they're handling all the pacing, and we call that implementation, right? So a narrative designer's job is to break that wall down whenever these two sides are kind of not cooperating. You can do that through both sides can use game verbs, right, as kind of a common language, right? When you write a story, it's always the verbs are there in the story for a mission or a quest. So talking about making better quest design, most quests include talking to an NPC. That's a verb, right? Then you usually, if it's a Witcher quest, you have to go travel and maybe do that investigate thing where you look at clues, right? So they're in the script as the writer is planning it out, and fight some enemies that show up, and oh no. And the designer also can be looking at those verbs too. So so the approach is really like finding a visual way for both parties to come together and talk about the quest beat by beat, but make sure that each beat is thinking about not only the plot story stuff that happens in a given beat, but what's the gameplay that's happening. Because if we don't do that, a lot of times a really beautiful and emotional story that we might have for a given mission or quest, we love this way it punches us in the gut, what this NPC is going to go through this big dilemma. A lot of times you write that out as a writer. I've found this too. I'm guilty of it. And you try to look at it of like, how are we going to make this work in a game? It has to be playable ultimately. So the gameplay is often really lacking. It's a lot of walking around and talking to people. And then I walk over here and I talk to this person. So, verbally it's harder to describe, but I hope that makes sense a bit just in terms of getting people together to think of it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I love the concept at the very least, like the base concept that every single person who contributes to the project, all of the game developers, and remember, if you contribute to the game in any way, you're a game developer. If you're doing customer service, you're a game developer. I hate when people gatekeep that.
Yes.
Regardless, all of those people who contribute to the game, all of those game developers are all telling the story together, and it's really true that communication, inter-team communication, especially like inter-department communication, is such a killer. It's amazing. Yep. All of you, especially those who are designers, but all of you will experience this. Within 2 years, less than that, within 6 months of working on your first project, you'll have a moment where you have a very explicit design doc and it says exactly what needs to happen. And you'll go and talk to somebody else and they will have a completely different interpretation of that doc. It's amazing how common that happens. So any tool that brings people together and really helps them see the same light, see the same vision is super powerful. What I was most like, everything you're talking about here is awesome. What the tool that I immediately incorporated that I hadn't used before was actually your beat cards. The beat cards are basically, if y'all have heard the term story beats before, they're individual, noticeable, identifiable moments in your story that are important in some way. So maybe like in Harry Potter, it's getting down to the Chamber of Secrets and talking to Voldemort. In Mass Effect, it's one of your first fights could be a story beat. It's actual like important moments that the generally narrative designer has put into the story. And then the beat card is a description of that moment that I'll read this here and then I'll ask you to give it a little bit more. The beat card generally includes a specific verb. That's kind of the base. So either it is a talk, a traverse, a sneak, a fight, a solve, and that kind of defines what kind of gameplay it is. And then in addition to that verb, it has a location, a desired emotion for the player to feel, and then just actual content. So you have an example in your very PDF, which we will link down below, by the way, go check it out, of a talk story beat where the location is the farm, the emotion is inquisitive, and the actual contents is the player talks to an NPC who asks them to help find some missing chickens.
Because we have to have a missing chickens quest.
You got it, right. Important, very important. So that is an example. I just love that as like a simple framework. Here's the story. Here's how it's meant to happen. And then you can hand that to a dozen people on the team. So that's what I'll hand you now. You want to take that any further?
Right. So I should say, and this method, this whole story beat card approach, this is not from my own brain. This is something I picked up while working with some clients at Lost Boys. And what's cool about it is, as I've been talking to people from other studios, there are some other studios that do a version of that, right? Which is cool. But sometimes it's like still a wall. I spoke to someone recently who was like, our story team makes their own kind of whiteboard. We use Miro. Is what I prefer to use. If you've ever heard of Miro, it's like a big collaborative whiteboard online where you can zoom around and scroll and add stuff. So they at that studio, I was talking about like they have the story team makes their own version of that, and the design team has been making their own, right? But it's almost like, whoa, could we bring these actually together? Is the realization, right? Why don't we? Once again, as your job, in my opinion, as the narrative designer, is to honestly, you're kind of the glue between departments. A lot of the times, you're the one that's making sure the story is pulled off. Ultimately, it's executed and implemented ultimately, and you need everyone's help to do that. So this Miro space is great for that. And so when I've used this process, it's very cool to see. Usually, it's like the writer will send or share. It's like usually an outline, a story outline, right? Just bullet
Mhm.
points. They're not writing dialogue yet, but it is that like we go here and then this happens and we have to go here and then we talk to this person. And what I've done is I, as the narrative designer and then the level designer, actually take that and in our own little separate meeting, um, we try to beat by beat decode or basically encode, I should say, each of those little bullet points. And yeah, like you're saying, oh, that's a talk beat. Okay, that's a search around, investigate beat. We're basically labeling each plot or story beat with the gameplay element, with the actual thing I'm doing on the sticks, right? And where it gets cool is when you color code them and show them, like, talk is always yellow and walking around is always a blue colored card. You make these little cards. It's a really great diagnostic tool. So like success story is then we bring the writer back into the room and, very politely, we kind of, this is a great story. First of all, we love this story. Like it's so compelling. If we were to go today and, kind of wave a magic wand and put this into a level, you can see by the cards, it's a lot of walking, walking, talking, walking, right? So it's basically you can come together before the expensive part of actually making the level, actually making all the art has actually happened. And you can find some moments to basically inject gameplay where there wasn't. And the best part is that gameplay can help support whatever the emotional content is, right?
Mhm.
So, like in the talk, I say like the writer might still be able to advocate and go, I hear you, but this beat right here, it has to be high tension. We have to feel, like we're in danger. So maybe a designer goes, let's add some combat then. Combat is a great
Mhm.
way to, inject some tension on the sticks and get us to feel like we're fighting for our lives or whatever. So anyway, that's like the verbal description. If you've got the slides in the chat, and that might be a nice pairing. But
Yeah. Yeah. For anyone who is listening, we will include these links in the description of the podcast episode as well. So you can check it out too if you're curious about this approach. I've definitely heard of story beats before. That's a fairly ubiquitous narrative tool, but I have not heard of beat
mhm.
cards before. And I love them as such a simple way to do exactly what you're talking about, both as just a communication tool between departments, but then also as a diagnostic tool. I am a huge fan of paper prototyping and basically anything that gives me a sense of how the game will play before we have to do any work.
Yeah.
And this is another great example of that. Like, oh, shoot. Yeah, all the player is actually experiencing is like 6 combats in a row. Let's break that up a little
Mhm.
bit. And then
Right.
it's also a way, I have always believed when I am doing team building in giving as much autonomy as possible to my team members. So this is also sort of a universal framework. So if I do have my quest laid out with these beat cards and there's a combat over here, I can be like, all right, combat designer, this is your little part. Here is the overarching set of beat cards. So this is what has already transpired to this point, and now you can
Yeah.
deliver the same emotion that we're all trying to deliver in that little fight.
Yes.
And that I think is
It's
brilliant.
it's a great making them bite sized like that is key because another reality of any type of job, but even game development, people often don't read like if you read a 10-page outline, you can't expect everyone to have the time to read that entire thing. So the educator in me, right, is sort of like,
Yeah,
has everyone done their homework? Right? Has everybody
the answer is
because
no.
storytelling in games, yeah, exactly. So like because storytelling in games is such a collaborative effort, you literally need 4 or 5 or more other people's talent to pull it off. You
Yep.
have to make sure that they've been onboarded to the story, that they know it, right? At least to some extent. So the
Mhm.
last point I make, so the beat cards make it easy, like you're saying. There's like, okay, cool. I can like comic book style read through this mission
Mhm.
in 5 minutes instead of 20.
Yep.
And the last point I make in the talk is kind of like what we need in order to break this wall down. We can use this approach, but really, I'm using writers and designers as the example, but it could be any two departments where normally writers mostly care about story, and designers mostly only care about gameplay. We need to have it switch, right? Our story writers need to start to learn the fundamentals of game design and understand that like game mechanics can be used for the purpose of storytelling. And then designers
Mhm.
also need to kind of do their homework and start to learn more about 101 story type stuff, right? Dramatic tension and pacing and all that, because that's on them usually to implement story. So
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
very true. Awesome. All right, I have taken enough of your time. Hopefully that intrigues you, audience, listener, to go check out Beat Cards, and hopefully it convinces you that no matter what your profession is, it may well be a useful tool for you to consider, or maybe even like pass off to your designers or your other
Mhm.
team members for them to use. I have already started using it myself. All right, so it is time for some community questions. We've got Old Saint Rick on the stage. Rick is MVP 110,000 times Super Saiyan question asker. Rick, would you like to start us off, as with so many of our episodes, with the first community question?
Sure. So I really love this idea of the storytelling toolkit because a lot of people, like you were saying, come with dialogue and cutscenes and like maybe a codex. But figuring out all the different ways that you can tell stories without words is huge and wonderful to convey with your narrative team. But I feel like the narrative team members will understand this, but how do you work with the people who are not narrative people? Like, how do you approach it with them to optimize the execution of your narrative visions?
It's a great question. To start, I would say it's also, if you are a narrative designer, it's also on you to
Mhm.
learn as much as you can about what other people on the team do and how they tend to think, and so that you can better meet them where they're at. You talk to an engineer who you might come in with this big, again, you're talking about emotions and character, whatever, and they're thinking about how the heck am I going to actually pull this off in code and an implementation side of it. So trying your best to speak their language is going to help, just in terms of finding the right way to kind of advocate, like, hey, this moment in this quest is really important from a story perspective, player, because we need them to feel this for this payoff. Um, but then being able to speak enough tech talk, for lack of a better term, to then go like, and I was thinking maybe we could leverage something in blueprints to do that if you're using Unreal Engine, or we could what could be really cool is actually we could do this really cheaply with a tool you've already built, and it's in the system, right? We already have this combat system. Going back to God of War, it's like, hey, hitting up an engineer and going, I was wondering if we could mess with the AI behavior tree of Atreus to get him to do this behavior, right? And then we're talking together about something engineering based. I hope that answered the question. I'm not sure if it did.
Yeah. It sounds like if you want to talk to an engineer to get help with telling the story, you communicate with them in technical design briefs and try to convey this is what I'm trying to do and here's my idea of how it is a mechanic. And then you translate story points into mechanics for the engineers because that's what the engineers understand.
Mhm.
Yes, I think that sounds right to me. And honestly, like, design tech briefs are great if you have the quick opening 10 minutes to grab them too and just kind of talk informally about it. Maybe you both might cook up ideas together or think of an example game that's maybe done something similar, and then that's your starting point. You go, hey, I want to do this, but we tweak it, from a different way that this other game did.
Yeah, it also seems like from your end it's that forward thought that you put in to how the other team members are going to receive it. So like if you have an artist who's going to work on a character, you try to think of all of the things that a artist might want to know in the back of their mind. Like this
Yes.
person likes to work on cars, so they're make sure you include a set of tools on their tool belt, and then that can help inform them to tell that bit of story.
That's a great analogy. In the same way that you would talk to a concept artist, you can talk to an engineer or designer, right? Just like you're saying, right? Giving them enough kind of fodder to then play with and figure out what will be needed. So yeah, that's great.
Cool. Yeah,
Awesome.
excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think one of the most dangerous and worst mentalities that I see in fresh designers, this is not in everybody, but I see it here and there and often enough to mention it, is the concept of a designer being the idea guy. um,
Mm.
where they're like, yeah, I come up with what the game should be, and then that's what it is. That's not what designers do. Designers, I mean, a little bit of that, sure, but I would say more so that a good designer is sort of a conduit for everything that's happening on your team, which includes ideas from other team members, but also just includes like constraints and the abilities of your team, the roadblocks of the project. So, for instance, it is so common, you will do it every day, where you will start out a design and you'll talk to somebody and they'll be like, oh, yeah, that thing that you've just designed is impossible. And you will
Yeah.
immediately have to pivot and figure out how it could work instead. Like a huge part of your job as a designer is listening and being active and present with your entire team and their abilities, and how you can best utilize that to tell the story you're imagining.
Yep.
Awesome. All right. Next question is from Baby Orby. who has asked me to read it for them. Their question is, and this one is near and dear to my heart. And before anything else, I'm so sorry, baby, and I'm so sorry everybody else who's feeling this. It sucks. Baby asks, how do you combat the feeling of rejection during this time where there's been so many layoffs in the industry? I've been out of game design from the Vancouver Film School since October, and I've been networking really hard all year, but I've yet to find anything. I've been designing for the past 4.5 years using online courses during this program and building up my portfolio. It feels hard to even find an intern position these days.
Yeah, I'm very sorry to hear that, and I'm in the same boat. I think a lot of us are, right? It is that classic, like, rejection is at times in your life going to be just part of your day to day, especially in a phase like this where you're actively applying. And it, so many people have already said, like, these are unprecedented times and all that kind of stuff. We all know, right? We all know just how wild this trend of layoffs has been. So it is
Mhm.
one, reminding, we say that all the time, but we forget, like, this is not normal. Like, this is a weirdly, like, the ocean, so to speak, is full of different fish, if you will, all trying to vie for the same little piece of chum that gets thrown out, right? When a job gets thrown out, like, all these, I imagine at least all these fish, and sometimes huge fish and sharks, whatever, everyone's going for one opportunity. And that's not like normally the case. So, like, reminding yourself of that every so often, like, this is not normal. And then also remembering that, like, the whole idea of how we do job applications and applying is I think kind of wild, kind of flawed. It makes it, I understand it because there's so many people to go through and try to give consideration to. But remember that, like, in a perfect world, you would be given the chance to actually, like, get to know those people and talk with them for more than, if you're lucky, you get a 30-minute recruiter screen, right? It's just kind of like,
Mhm.
30 minutes is not nearly ever enough time to really say who you are, say what you're about, and to get someone to actually get to know you. So just reminding yourself too that the process that we have to work with, we've got no choice but to work with this process of trying to apply. If you get rejected, remember that, like, you don't know the actual reason why they did. A lot of times a job gets posted because they have to post it and they've already got the person lined up internally or something who's going to get that job, right? So it's not always, often it's not very frequently a reflection of, we didn't like you specifically, right? And remembering that, like, they didn't even get the chance to maybe get to know you actually, right? They had no choice but to judge you off of a one-page PDF, and that doesn't fully show who you are. I'm not sure if that's
Yeah.
helpful because it still stings, but yeah.
Yeah, I think like something to call out here is just yes, it is unusual, but also I know that doesn't really help. Like, there's a dissatisfaction with that answer, I know.
Yeah.
Because of course, like, well, this is the situation I'm in right now. I the question asker, or the people who are feeling like this.
Mhm.
I think that this time period is one to stay as humble as you possibly can and appreciate that this is a journey. Um, it takes it takes a lot to break into games, and especially right now. But I think if you can think of it more like stepping stones, and every step gets you a little bit closer, and roles that
Yep.
aren't what you imagined and are even outside of games are appropriate things to do right now. And
Right.
recruiters, understand that. And yeah, anything you can get right now is good. And I'm sorry it sucks. Find some friends, find support networks,
That's,
and
yeah, just,
yeah, make friends with
yeah.
Quinn on LinkedIn and tell him that you're sad.
Yeah, no, and a lot of you already, I mean, if you're in this academy, you're already doing this too. You're pursuing your
Yeah.
own creative work, which is just as legitimate as any other, right? And so, like,
Right.
doing the craft, you can do that regardless of being with a certain studio or not. And
Mhm.
so that all still counts, and it's extremely relevant when it comes to, like, if you're doing a AAA thing, I have a portfolio I need to show, like, you're building and collecting. It's all additive. It's all positive movements you're making.
Yeah. Yeah, and it does continue. I'm a big fan of anime, as I'm sure many of us game developers are. And it really is kind of the Dragon Ball saga. You just, no matter how much skill you gain and how far you get, there's always more to learn and more skill to gain,
Yeah.
and it never really stops. So yeah, I guess hopefully that helps. Revel in the
So that,
fact that you'll always be learning and growing. Yeah.
one quick metaphor that one of my very close friends gave me when I, got the news I would no longer be at Lost Boys was this kind of, you might feel like you're on an open ocean, like when you open Subnautica, if you played
Hmm.
Subnautica, right? It's all horizon. There's no
Hmm.
landmarks except for the massive spaceship.
Yep.
You're on a raft right now in the ocean. You do not know where the closest island is, so you need to start rowing. But that island could be 100 days away. It could be 3 days away. You have no idea. That's how the ocean works, right? Like that much distance. But as long as you're touching those oars at least a couple times, even if it's just you applied to one job or did whatever thing, that's still moving you towards that island, whatever that's going to be. So
Yeah. And keep making games. Like that's you may not be able to get paid for games, and that sucks. But you can absolutely make and release games. And releasing games is the biggest thing that'll get you closer to getting paid to make games.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe start your own company. Anyway, Biscuit would like me to read this next question. Do you have any tips for people who are new to networking? How do I approach and sell myself to others?
Sure. Tips I have. I think we mentioned it really early in this, but just just being, in case it hasn't been said, like being genuine and being your genuine self, even if it's your kind of like LinkedIn, voice that you're using, that's fine, your professional self. But the biggest thing is I think like I said earlier, people can smell from a mile away if you're kind of just trying to hit them up and going, hi, can you get me this job I just saw posted, please? Or like I don't know you at all, you have no sense of rapport. I have found most success when I reach out to somebody specific that I've researched because I am actually hoping to learn from them, right? It's coming from a place of learning, from a place of kind of that, like you said, Willem, like, being a little humble and just being like, finding, and the other tip actually is, and people have said this before, a CEO of Sony Santa Monica, for example, is too busy usually to even be on LinkedIn. So you're going to have better luck finding people who seem like, if you're using LinkedIn as the tool, seem like they're on, kind of that starting staff. They're at the associate level or the staff level of whatever job title you're kind of looking to do. They probably are actually more open to helping somebody because they probably were in your shoes not that long ago as well, right? So they remember very, very raw their search and how they got in. And people, if this hour-long podcast was not an example, people love talking about themselves. So, but use that, right? Like, it's sort of like you want to learn about them. You actually want to hear their story and what worked for them. And then the next part is, it's like a plant, right? Like, water that plant every so often. Like, ask them if you're cool. Like, hey, if you'd be cool with it, I'd love to like keep you posted on my journey as I go forward and show you work I've done, show you examples and things, and get maybe some feedback on my portfolio. Start to do that every so often, and this person is seeing you. They're seeing the work you're doing. They're seeing, these push-ups you're basically doing for these skill sets. And then as you do that more and more with more people, slowly but surely, you want to be in the back of their head when they're at their studio, and it does happen. They're at the studio, and their manager comes to them, and they go, "Hey, we need a new associate person, or we need a person on your team. Do you know anybody?" You want to be that person, like, yes, I do actually know somebody, like, very well at this point, and I've worked to prove it. So they can then be your advocate, on the inside, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, it is I love that. I love your answers here. I think they're all right. I sometimes like to encourage people to think about networking like a business to business sale, a B2B sale, where you are they're somehow getting value out of you. And usually it's not dollars, but for instance, you're on this podcast right now, Quinn, because it feels good to talk about yourself for a little bit and to feel like you're helping the next generation. And that's value that you're getting out of being here. And we get value, of course, by having a cool guest on the show. So we're sort of mutually helping each other out. And that's really how I encourage you to think about it. Same thing I said earlier, like try not to make it too transactional or anything. But yeah, you asked specifically that question, how to sell yourself. I don't think it's so much about selling yourself. Yeah, I think it's more about just having a good conversation and giving them a moment to talk about themselves. And by the way, yeah, the tip to not talk to the CEOs and instead just talk to like some staff or even junior, engineers or workers is really smart. Look for people who are just a couple of years ahead of you because they're also the ones who aren't yet being bombarded with people asking them for help.
Yep. And oftentimes can be the one who actually gets to say something, advocate for you, right, on that team. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Awesome. All right. We've got Wendy up on stage. Wendy, would you like to ask the next question?
Yes. Hey, how's it going?
Hey,
I'm gonna be quick because I know there's another one or two. I don't know if I'll have time for it, but I work in higher education, so I'm very much
nice.
interested in the first part of your OG story, where you well, not the first, not the well, that was fun too, the kindergarten fun. I wish I'd have been in your class. Um, wonder what other skills you've used in game design from being an educator.
Oh yeah, great. I guess yeah. For the sake of time, I've said this recently. I'm amazed at how frequently I use education fundamentals in working with people and talking with people. As a game designer specifically, like I use terms like scaffolding, right? I use terms like prior knowledge. I use all these kind of really good like education teacher terms. Zone of proximal development is huge for games, right? Like where are players starting from mechanically, and how do we slowly build them to a more, a better state of autonomy, or competency is maybe the word I'm looking for. So yeah, as you can see, extremely relevant. And so in interviews and things like that, do not be afraid to, like, with authority, pull that out, right? And state like that it is absolutely relevant that you've been in education.
That's so wonderful, and I'm so glad to hear that. That I'm just pumped now. Thank you so much.
Good. Yeah.
Thank you, Wendy. Yeah, jargon, of course, is not always helpful, but like one of my favorite. I mention this periodically because I just want to make sure everybody hears this quote. One of my favorite quotes from this podcast ever was when we talked with George the Fat Man Sanger, who's kind of like a legendary audio dude in the game industry. Who's one of the first audio people there was doing games.
Nice.
And he, at the very end of his interview on the show, said, "Find the U-shaped hole in the universe." And I love that.
Nice.
And I think I think it's a great example. Like whatever your history is that brought you to games, whether it be in education or whether it be in something entirely different. Our COO at the Indie Game Academy is ex-military. He ran a freaking destroyer in the ocean. Like once lost all of his radar and had to steer his people back to America with no navigational data. Like that is a very specific history and absolutely colors the games you're going to make and deliver to people. And so don't be scared to like lean on that past expertise. It makes you a unique candidate, and it really makes you wonderful at telling your kind of stories. Awesome. All right, it is time for the last question of the day. We've got Uke Wolf up on stage. Uke, would you like to ask what you got?
Is that the discipline that you're mostly focused on?
Thanks.
Is like art?
Great talk.
Yeah.
So I was actually also interested in the education
absolutely. I mean,
space.
I
And Willem, I know you've done
with Learning
some work
Games
in it as
Network
well.
and with
But
Fable
in
Vision
your
primarily, they're
experience,
both on the
were there
East
any
Coast.
specific visual
and
arts
every
needs that
project
kind
I
of
was
arose
on
when you're
had at
working
least
on gamifying
one, two, maybe even
education?
3 artists on it. So in the traditional game development sense, yeah, like there are
Yes,
absolutely
So
those roles.
I'm an
Funny enough,
artist.
I think it's still live, but here at UW Madison, kind of a rare job. They posted a game artist job, on campus. So there's actually those roles do happen, and so there's any number of educational products more broadly too, where you could start. Right, think about like the big ed tech kind of Pearson. Those places also need, even if it's just UI design and UI art, those kind of things. There's different kind of tangential places you could kind of start to chip in as you sort of narrow in on maybe where you want to apply your skills. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, if you're talking about specific assets to practice, Uke, in the education space, it definitely relies pretty heavily on UI. So I think UI art, and just like interesting UI use cases will all be really good to practice. And then I feel like it also has a lot of character work. There's a ton of mascots in the educational space.
Cute animals and So that the button press thing is huge, right? You think about your end user is going to be mostly a child, so like iPad usage and all that kind of stuff. If you can show user flows and things like that would be really massive. And then if you can ground it in some of your educational background, where it's like this design was, fueled by blah 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 theory. Yeah, that could be huge.
And we know this will be the perfect thing to teach math or whatever.
Right.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Of course. Thank you, Uke. I'm going to ask this rapid fire answer this for me, Quinn. You have 30 seconds, just because I think it's a really good question. Vishnu asks, could you share some strategies or tips on how to deliver a good story or narrative as a beginner in game development? how does a beginner make a good story in 60 seconds or less?
Gotcha. Yeah.
Be as
thanks so
simple
much.
as possible, I would say. Really try to rein in your scope. Tell a simple story, or start with an existing one, a moral of a story, right? Like from Mother Goose, things like that.
Yeah.
And then I would lastly say, keep your scope from a game development. Keep it small. Can you express it in just a mechanic? I forget the name of it, but there's that 2D pixel game where the guy walks left to right. All you do is walk forward, and it's showing his timeline of life. And then he
I haven't played
meets a
that.
partner along the way. I forget what it's called, but it's
Yeah.
beautiful, and there's no words, there's no sound, it's just walking, and they could tell the story just by pushing right. So that's
Wow.
maybe start simple, start small.
Yeah, I love that. Start simple, start small is good for everybody. And then the other thing I would say, this is a big one, and it took me so long to finally accept this, and I say this a lot now, so you may have heard me say this before. Copy. Copy other people's work.
Yes.
Yeah. Just go and, if there's a game that you like that is reasonably scoped and that you can build, or maybe you can do like just a visual novel sort of version of the same story or something like that. Like, use existing story formats, use existing cliches. That's all good. You're going to learn sort of the basics of your toolkit by doing that.
Try to Google game where you just walk right so I can think the name of that game, but I can't.
There's a lot of those, I guess.
It's out there.
The first thing I thought of was Thomas Was Alone, but that must not be what you're referring to.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, so it is the end of the episode. If you find that, we can include it in the links down below.
Sure.
Before we say goodbye, there's two things we always like to do here. The first one is to assign some homework. So we've talked about a bunch of stuff here today. What is something that the audience can do in the next week that'll take them about an hour to practice some of what we've talked about here today?
Okay. If we want to fill it to an hour, I will expand it. So what I was going to suggest is, now that we talked about the toolkit, right, all the ways that stories can be told, not dialogue and not cutscenes, you can still, those are still very important, but look at your library of games you have, indie games or otherwise, and just think about them or play through one and see if you can detect as many as possible other tools that were used, right? Environmental storytelling. Did they use a system to tell a story? Was there a really cool level design trick they did to get me to feel a certain, because remember, stories can be small. When I say stories, they don't need to be a 3-act, 30-hour campaign. Like small stories, small moments of expressing a theme. I would say just go back to the games that you really enjoyed but study it with this maybe new lens, as narrative design lens, and see what you can find.
Love that. Awesome. Yeah. So for your homework for this week, go back to a couple of your favorite games and distill what's working in their stories. I'm gonna even maybe add a little bit, see if you like this. I want you to call out specific story beats. So what are actual moments that happen that drive the story forward, and then perhaps even make some beat cards for them. And therefore you're gonna get a little practice doing that too. Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. All right. Homework is to look at past games, play through them, figure out what is happening to tell the story that is not just the text. How is it being told in the environment? How is it being told through combat? How is it being told through engineering? That's a tough one. I loved your example earlier of like changing the AI tree. And then maybe make some story beats to practice that. Post that on LinkedIn for us and tag us, Indie Game Academy. You can tag Quinn as well as myself, Willem. And if you're feeling a little bit too shy to do it online, although we encourage you to, it's great practice, you can also post it here in the Discord. All right, it is finally time to wrap it up. Quinn, is there any last words of wisdom you'd like to give, or anything you'd like to plug here at the end of the episode?
Honestly, at this point, we're near the end of the year. Just keep going. Like, it's corny, but it's do this and continue to find what excites you about it, and the rest will come with time. So
the best games, I've been doing so much research into what results in good games for the sake of Foundry that we have coming up. And there's a lot of, thoughts on that, but I feel like the biggest thing that I run into over and over again, and that I've run into my own career, is just like when people are having a good time making the game and they're excited to make the game is better. And that's basically universally true in this industry. Yeah. Totally. So have a good time and keep going. Stuff's hard sometimes. You got this, though.
It's hard. Yep.
Yep. Awesome. All right, Quinn, this has been a lovely episode. Thank you for being here and for giving us some insight. Absolutely. Thank you for those who asked questions.
Thanks for having me, gang.
100%. And thank you for those who are listening. And as always, we ask that if you enjoyed, that you think of just one other person who may also enjoy this episode and send it along to them for us. That helps us out tremendously. We'll be back here Wednesday, 12 p.m. Eastern Time for the next one. Come by the Discord and ask your own questions. There's links to join down below. And otherwise, we'll see you then. Thanks, Quinn. Bye,
Cool.
everybody.
See everybody. Bye.
Adios.